Okay, class. Today we're going to talk about the volume of a prism using unit cubes. Okay, so the idea of today is using volume, but to figure out how many cubes we can fit into a rectangular prism. So we're going to have to know the volume, but we're actually going to count cubes as if we're packing the item. So I only have one example today, but I'm going to show you two different methods that you can use to find the answer. So I'm going to go ahead and go to our first example. Okay, so in our example here, our goal is how many cubes with an edge length of 1 inch will fit into the prism. So I have a prism down here with side lengths of 3.5 inches, 3.5 inches, and 3.5 inches, and we want to know how many 1/4 inch cubes can fit inside of there. Okay, so little teeny tiny cubes that we want to draw in there. Okay, now here's method one. Method one is we are going to find the area of the cube, the large cube, so that's going to be volume equals length times width times height. Multiply those three numbers, so volume equals 3.5 times 3.5 times 3.5. Okay, remember when I multiply, I'm going to have to turn that into improper fractions, so that's 2 times 3 is 6 plus 1 is 7. They're all the same, so that makes that a little easy. When you multiply that, you get 343 eighths. Now I'm going to keep that in the improper fraction because I'm going to have to use it again. Okay. Now move on to step 2. In step 2, I want to find the volume of one of these little cubes that I have in here. Let's find the volume of one of those little cubes. So that's also volume equals length times width times height, and they all have a side length of 1/4. So I'm going to do 1/4 times 1/4 times 1/4. When I do that, I get volume equals 1/64. Now, I know how big the volume is of the large cube. I'm going to now divide that by the volume of each little cube to see how many will fit inside of there. When I do that, I will get volume 343 eighths divided by 1/64. Remember, when you divide fractions, you got to multiply by the reciprocal. So that's 343 eighths times 64/1. When I multiply those across, I get 21,952 over 8 times 1 is 8. When you simplify that, 8 goes into 21,952, 2,744 times, which means that I can get 2,744 cubes inside of there. Okay, that's a lot of cubes. Now, this is nice technique. You can get the answer. The problem with this technique is if you have a little bit left over, it takes all that extra space and checks to see if a cube can fit in there, when in reality, you might not actually be able to get all the cubes across in the length and width and the height. So there could be some kind of error sometimes when you do this technique, but this will give you an idea if they fit at the length, the width, and the height. Okay, go ahead and pause if you need to. That's a lot of writing there. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the second method. Okay, in our second method, same question, how many 1/4 inch cubes? In the second method, this one will help with that figuring out if there's any extra space that you might be accounting for that you can't actually fit a cube into. And this one, before I start multiplying and finding the volume, I am going to check to see how many cubes I can get in the length, how many cubes I can get in the width, and how many cubes I can fit in the height. So in this example, I am going to take the length here, right here, the 3.5 length, and I'm going to divide that by 1/4. Okay, I want to see how many cubes I can get in there. So that's going to be 7/2 divided by 1/4, which is 7/2 times 4/1, which is 28/2, which equals 14. So I know that I can fit 14 cubes across the bottom here. Now, since they're all 3.5 divided by 1/4, I have the work for all the sides. This would also be 14, and that would be 14. Now, if they were different numbers, I would have to do more work to figure out how many cubes I can fit for the length, how many cubes I can fit for the width, and how many cubes I can fit for the height. Then now what I'm going to do is, now that I know how many cubes I can fit, I can just multiply my volume in cubes. So I take my volume equals my length, my width, my height, How many cubes can I fit? Well, I can fit 14 cubes for my length times 14 cubes for my width times 14 cubes for my height. And when I multiply that, guess what I get? Oh, 2,744, and that's cubes. So you get the same answer. I personally like method 2 better. It helps, I think it's a little faster, a lot less multiplying and dividing, and I also think that it helps in case of a problem where you might have some extra space left over. You don't have to worry about if that's an issue or not. Also, what's nice about this, if you're not very good at dividing, you could have just counted your 1/4 cubes, knowing that 3.5 inches, well, that's 3 inches, 1/4, so that's 3 times 4 to get to 3 inches, and then 2 more to get to that half. So you can kind of count it out instead of having to divide. Okay, so that's my 2 methods. So hopefully you wrote them both down. Pause if you need to, rewind. If there's anything else you need to know, let me know. Otherwise, have a wonderful night.